So what exactly are we up to in this class? By week 5, that is a question that should arise, correct? Are we learning lists of the elements and constituents of drama or narrative or fiction or the short story or the novel or the poem or some subset of a genre or not a subset of a genre, the genre boldly at large? We're headed soon to find out something about poetry, of course. No. I mean, you can tell that I have not been distributing, I think you would have noticed, if I'd been distributing lists of generic criteria. We have been interested in generic criteria. We've been interested in specific generic criteria, the drama, the chorus, for example, of the tragedy, right? But we have not been exhaustive. We have not felt that, or I have not felt, and maybe you've noticed this, I have not felt that it is our ambition in this class for you to learn all about the various elements of genre, any particular genre, drama, tragedy. A course in tragedy would be the course in which you would learn all the various elements of tragedy. We're learning, this will be maybe no surprise to some of you who are seniors, I think we have a few of you in the class. We're learning what you already know, right? A lot of it. That there are such genres, there are such genres, there are such elements of such genres. We're also learning something that I think you sort of know, easy to forget, in part because you've internalized it to a certain degree, or you will internalize it, right? And it's something that has to be known, I think, has to be grasped at a certain level, as I'm calling it here, in the more sophisticated and firmer collegiate college level manner required of majors and minors. And what is that? It's that it pays to know about these elements of genre, right? These characteristics of the various genres, these dynamics of the subgenres, these mechanics of the various literary forms. Boy, does it pay. Boy, does it pay when you approach the reading of an individual work of art with some awareness, okay, of the tradition. We're going to get to that down the road here in this class. At this point, we're just looking at the genres themselves, not so much the tradition of what's been said, but the kinds of things that have been said, that have been written, right, and established. Boy, does it help to know a little bit about those dynamics, okay, those mechanics, the elements, of course, that in fact dynamically, okay, are present to us as we read a play like Trifles, right? I'm not going to go back to Trifles. Rather go to the plot-story distinction for a good example at this point, though there are numerous such good examples. What we've been doing up to this point in the course is accumulating good examples of these various elements of mostly drama up to this point. Now we're with fiction and narrative, right? These various elements that knowledge of which tremendously enhances the reading experience, okay? And the experience of understanding literature and the experience of appreciating literature at its, at a higher level, at a level that is to be expected of educated people who've been to college, okay? And especially when they're English majors and minors, although I think that the kind of thing we're doing in a class like this is, has a more general kind of application, perhaps, but we won't get into that right now. The plot-story distinction offers a good example. To be aware that such exists, simply that very sophisticated readers, okay, although the distinction doesn't depend upon your being sophisticated. I think even if you're not very sophisticated, at some level it's working on you, okay? You're just not aware enough of it for it to really be of much aid to you. This distinction, okay, that has been of such importance to, let's call them more experienced readers, okay, of narrative, to be mindful of it as we read is to put ourselves in a position to see certain things that we're otherwise not going to see, okay? And just, again, this is just one example. This is the plot-story opposition. When you're aware of it, are you not more aware than you otherwise would be of the question of causality? So the plot-story distinction really matters. Yes, it does. Mod3 Q3 asked you to define plot.
and then read a plot summary as opposed to a story summary of Chopin's The Story of an Hour. Consulting and combining descriptions available in the Norton and the glossary, as does an unnamed student, we could quote and summarize as follows. The king died, then the queen died is a story. The king died, and then the queen died of grief is a plot. This is Forster's distinction, notable for its simplicity. The latter stirs speculation about why things happen. That's the plot. Why the queen dies. The plot goes deeper than the events of the story and dives into motivation and reasons for actions, as one of you puts it. Quote, the plot summary accordingly provides a comprehensive overview of the why. A story summary, by contrast, would just tell you the event, being but a bare synopsis of the temporal order of what happens. And that's a quote from the glossary. Well, so what did you guys do with this question? McKenna, plot means the sequence of events that make up a narrative. It focuses on the structure of the story, including exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Good, but is that not just the story that you're talking about, McKenna? Samantha argues, quote, plot refers to the sequences of events in the story, emphasizing cause and effect. I think that's all you needed to add, McKenna, rather than just a chronological listing of what happens. Unlike story, which is simply the raw events, I like that phrase, raw events in order, plot highlights how one event leads to another, building tension, irony, or deeper meaning. Sanai agrees, quote, plot is the precise sequence of events in the story, stressing causality and structure above just a chronological set of events. Alyssa, quote, plot focuses on how and why things happen in a story versus being limited to what happens. Grace references Forster, with whom we began, who, quote, writes about the difference between story and plot, naming one of the key differences is causality. What Juana calls that additional emphasis on causality that we have in plot that distinguishes a plot summary from attentive to such matters, from a story summary, not attentive to such matters of, questions of why. Satisfying plot summaries followed on the heels of most of your definitional gambits, which I've just reported on. Reading through them, I now note that most centered on the ending, which obviously poses that central plot question, and we're going to get into this a little bit further in the next plate. Why? Indeed, a central plot question, the why. Why does Mrs. Mallard die? As we know, what makes this story so great? I mean, this is clear, isn't it? That I think story gives you one answer, plot another one. Why does Mrs. Mallard die? And I'm going to talk about that in the next plate. Why does Mrs. Mallard die? Samantha mentions that early bit of foreshadowing of what is to come by pointing out how, quote, in the beginning of the story, we're introduced to the main character, Louise Mallard, a woman with a bad heart condition. Okay, here we have the how. She dies of a heart attack. The why. Why does she have the heart attack? That remains an issue. The shock of seeing her husband, whom she thought dead alive, triggers a fatal heart attack for her, and the doctors declare that she died of the joy that kills. McKenna, she is overwhelmed with shock. Good, but are we to trust the doctors? Again, I'll get into this a little bit further and deeper in the next plate. Sanai, quote, readers recognize an irony. Her death is from the shock of lost freedom, not happiness. Indeed, having first grieved upon hearing her husband has died, suddenly she feels free. She murmured it over and over under her breath, free, free, free. It is the sudden collapse of this new sense of a widow's freedom, not joy at her husband's being alive after all that kills. Grace concurs. This change from grief to joy sets up the dramatic irony of the ending, in which her husband returns home, indeed still alive. Mrs. Mallard's joy and hope of freedom is instantly shattered, and she dies. Juana, she dies, quote, of a broken heart, what could have been had her husband been dead, rather than a joy. No doubt, Alyssa explores the theme of the story, the end product, perhaps, of any good plot summary. I want to repeat that. Any good plot summary should point us, should it not, at what could be described as, could be characterized as the theme of that story. The answer to the central why of the story has got to be somewhere near that thing that we call the theme of the story. Here's what Alyssa had to say. Quote, the narrative emphasizes Chopin's critique of marriage being restrictive and entrapping. The death of Louise is not for tragedy and drama, but instead to symbolize consequences of denying women autonomy. X, a student in a different section. Quote, Chopin's tale raises questions in her time period about the limitations imposed by marriage and the inherent desire for individual freedom. Women in this time period had no real life to live when trapped in the constraints of their marriage. More on plot and theme coming next. Okay, working a little further with this idea of themes, okay, how themes might emerge from plot-wise considerations of the story. And I say themes plural, right? So different formulations of what you see as the larger significance of the story, which emerge from a careful consideration of the plot. And let's take Chopin's Story of an Hour again. One of you writes, looking at the ending line, when the doctors came, they said she died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Without the context of the rest of the story, a reader might think that Mrs. Mallard learned her husband died and was so overjoyed to discover him alive that she passed away. That's to the extent you paid any attention to the why. You would just quickly, okay, induce or infer that that is why she died. You just agree with the doctors, right? The plot, however, disagrees. I like the way the students put this. The plot disagrees. It begs to differ. That's put so well. Plot and story often disagree in the sense that they do not coincide. Okay? Here in Chopin, I would argue that we have disagreement to the degree that they quarrel. They get in a big argument. The story is so busy telling us what? Says that she died of joy. Joy of the sort or of the intensity that can kill. Right? What does plot say? Well, as Michael says, the story, whatever plot might say, the story would not care. For example, why Josephine is the one breaking the news to Louise, which is something that plot might wonder about. Or if Louise really loved Brentley or not, which plot would find a very pressing question. Story, rather, would assume that she did, and would just walk away thinking, I learned something about joy in this story. Joy can kill, right? Just how intense it can get. I'm so excited to see what happens that I might miss a detail. That mode of joy ascribed to Mrs. Emmett is ascribed not by the narrator, but by doctors, right? And once again, we just move on, taking the doctors as the wise people who understand what just happened. What about the plot then? I think it might wonder a little bit about these doctors. Are they quacks? Not exactly, but if I'm doing a plot-wise consideration of the story, right, I'm walking away thinking, really thinking, joy, schmoy. It's disappointment that does the killing here. And I now decide that to explain what has happened here, we really do need to move past the question of intensity, the question of the quantity of joy, right? To sort. I mean, the doctors are kind of like that. The joy that kills, right? They make it sound like it's a different sort of joy than other sorts of joy. But it really, wouldn't we just say it's just such a massive amount of joy that, given her weakened heart condition, she just dies. So plot moves us genuinely beyond questions of quantity to questions of quality, right? From the question of the degree or magnitude of joy to the question of the sort of joy. And in fact, it's not really a sort of joy at all. It's a sort of a very different emotion. I think you'd agree. It's a sort of disappointment, really in many ways the opposite of the exact species of joy that the doctors have in mind. It's a sort of disappointment that's at issue here. Disappointment of one's hopes for the future, of one's anticipation, of freedom. Reconfinement, okay? The prospect of reconfinement, subsequent to a taste of freedom, okay? And a savoring of the prospect, the immediate prospect of living a freer life. Okay, that's what can kill. And there's a suggestion here that necessary to human existence is at least some element of freedom. So you see how we're moving towards a theme that's a little bit different from what we were talking about on the previous, and certainly different from the doctors, what the doctors would take away from this story, from this plot. What story told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. The plot now tells us it's truly a short fiction about the need to be free. Can you see that? That's a very, very different sense of what the story is all about that we take away from the story/plot. When we read plot-wise, pay very careful attention to the why, and don't just sort of rush by questions of why as we just sort of log and kind of write down and record what happened next, what happened next, what happened next. Note how Joseph identifies a slightly different and not discordant theme by noting what the supposedly grieving Mrs. Mallard sees as she looks out of the window. As John A. notes, such details are crucial, clues and hints. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a quiver with a new spring life. Quoted by one of you on the previous plate, right? There is more written and described, well, that other line, the delicious breath of rain was in the air. There's more written and described about the springtime, a time when a sense of freshness and beginnings are usually viewed, this student writes. This relates to the plot because it is the undertones of what is really being mentioned. Mrs. Mallard feels free for the first time, and she's seeming to enjoy it. As Nanette notes, Mrs. Mallard, still imagining the freedom she now has, exits the room like a goddess of victory. I would add only, and I'm really not adding anything new here, but just emphasizing something that is implicit in both what Nanette is saying, and what John is saying, right? Which is that Mrs. M is coming to self-knowledge in this scene, and she's doing so by observing her own authentic, unmediated vision of the world. In a sense, she's watching herself as she watches what happens outside of the window. And she's seeing how she now sees, and she's seeing that she has escaped the conventional expectations of how she's supposed to see, according to those around her, right? And I would argue that it matters a lot that she's alone at this point. There's nobody around feeling sorry for her because her husband has just died. She's left alone. She's happy to be alone, and she's able to, in a sense, escape all those social expectations that crowd upon one, okay, upon the death of a loved one, right? And so I would argue that, and once again, I'm getting this from you guys. I think you're arguing implicitly at some level that this is a story about the virtue of solitude, the nature of solitude, the power of solitude. It's when she's alone that this good stuff happens, right? The virtue of solitude emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention, right? Another such different, if not discordant theme, right? Once again, I don't think these themes bang up against each other and negate each other. I think they all sort of fold one within the other. And all of them can be more or less true at the same time. Here's another such different, if not discordant theme. Men and women oppress each other even if it's out of love or kindness, right? This is, the quiz item some of you are going to see, some of you have seen. By the time you read this, by the time you see this, you probably are taking the quiz, right? And one of the items is directed towards this moment, this issue, right? The question of the love or want thereof of Brentley for his wife. I would argue that he does love her. And I would argue that she's presenting us with a view of love that is maybe a little bit unconventional, right? Love and freedom can be at odds. Not always do we, when loving a thing, set it free. So there's a rather, I hate to call it a cynical view of love being offered by the story, but I think it's a complex view of love and one that is distinctly unconventional. It does not see love as simply, and we are talking about an emotion that deserves that name. It does not see love as this simply, like an experience or an emotion that is just simply virtuous and that is simply healthy and constructive for everyone who is its, I almost said victim, for everyone who is its object, right? So Chopin's story then, just to sum up a little bit what we've just been saying on this play, Chopin's story then is a story about love as well as freedom and about individuality as well as love, right? Not a mention of joy in that formulation, you will notice. A virtuous Poe? What of that question? Mullen writes, subtlety of motivation is presumed to be a virtue of fiction. The more subtle the motive, the more virtuous the fiction, the worthier the fiction. Recall mod3 Q2, which a number of you attempted, which pleased me. I thought it was a subtle question that was being asked. Quote, how virtuous is Poe's story according to the definition of virtuous fiction provided by Mullen? Does it imbue its protagonist, Montresor, with a complex motive? That's what Mullen argues virtuous, worthy fictions do. Whereas Poe's killer, not really all that different from Spart's Lord Lucan, who's notable for his superficiality, his sociopathic lack of complex motivation, his textbook aspirations, in the words of a former student, or his lack of aspirations of any kind, what a Shakespearean critic calls motiveless malignancy. Well, nice job on a tricky issue. The question of the virtuous story, as Mullen might define it, is best approached by distinguishing between subtlety or complexity motivation and subtlety in its presentation or narration, what Mullen calls subtlety of analysis. And if we factor these two, we get something interesting. We get an array, right? A matrix. One may have, with respect to a character's motives in any story, number one, the first condition, analyze complexity. Henry James's work, if you ever read any of that, is a good example. The second condition, unanalyzed complexity. Depth of motive merely hinted at, clearly indicated but left mysterious. Does that fit the story? Number three, analyze simplicity. Unusual. The narrator would keep saying there's nothing deeper going on in this person's mind and heart. Sparks' novel is perhaps a good example. And 4, unanalyzed simplicity, as in a joke, a folktale, a fable, or what have you, right? Number 1 would be the most virtuous. Number 4, the least. So I could allow that to sink in, but I know that you could stop this at any moment and review. So I'll allow you to do that if you would wish. Pressing on that. Let's get to what you guys had to say. Connor claims that, quote, Montresor's inordinate desire for both punishment and control, as well as the ambiguity surrounding the insult that gives rise to the story, they give the story subtlety. But several students have their doubts about this. Yes, it is a mystery what insult would produce such fierce responses we have in Montresor. But we wonder less to the extent that we find Montresor simply morally monstrous. Monsters, right? This is what makes them monsters. They don't need much of an excuse. Or if they're morally monstrous enough, lacking a deep motive, they create one. That's a pretty good definition of a psychopath. Thinking thus, right, go back to our matrix, we have a number 3, analyze simplicity. The narrator would keep saying that perhaps nothing is going on deeper in this person's mind or heart. And that's, I think, where a number of you would place the story. Sanai finds little depth in Montresor and little virtue in the story. Quote, Montresor's lack of psychological depth, his shallow, almost psychopathic attitude, quote, restricts the story's virtue per Mullen standards, so rendering the story more about horror, which I think is a very good term to introduce into our discussion, than profound human motivation. Horror stories don't have a lot of worry and interest in complex states of motivation. The character who wanders down into the basement having heard a sound, we're not like, oh, look at the depth of human, cognition going on as he or she walks down into the basement, right? Rather, these conventions, these horror movie conventions, horror book conventions. Samantha more or less concurs. Quote, Montresor's lack of explanation adds to the story's creepiness. He's calm, polite, and completely in control as he leads Fortunato into the catacombs only to bury him alive. He isn't just lashing out randomly. He has a personal sense of justice, even if it doesn't make much sense to us, being seemingly out of proportion to the degree of insult suffered, as we've already noted. But perhaps we're not invited to wonder about it, right? Montresor's taking things so personally. Hey, that's what psychopaths do, right? So we're still with number 3. Logan adds, unlike characters with more complexity, Montresor does not show pity, remorse, or reflect on his actions. In his detached way, that way of the psychopath, Montresor, quote, focuses on the act of revenge itself instead of any complex reasoning behind it. And is that not because there is no complex reasoning behind it? Of course, as several note, the very inaccuracy or even opacity of motive can itself be fascinating. And Faith had an eloquent reaction along these lines. Montresor's insistence on and persistence in a perfect revenge suggests deeper psychological involvement, even if his reasoning stays unclear. While Poe does not provide access to the deep interiority that Mullen values, Montresor's cold creation and unreliable narration create an uneasy effect, forcing the reader to acknowledge the mystery of human cruelty. So well said. But again, mere persistence and resoluteness, again, are not enough, are they? We have all met people committed to mistreating others for apparently no good, no deep reason, and they can come across as machines or animals, hardly the subjects of what Mullen would call virtuous fiction. Now, I think Faith is onto something, especially with that last phrase about the mystery of human cruelty. Taking a step back from the story, we may enter, I would call it the universe of horror, and we'd wonder about the motives of those who made these machines or made these animals. But you understand that that's a step away from the story itself. The story itself is not making us wonder about them. We're only wondering in retrospect at the spectacle that we have seen, as opposed to wondering as the spectacle unfolds at the complexity of motive, of desire, wish, and conscience, this sort of play of sensibility over the question of whether or not to commit the murder. We don't have that, right? And its very absence can be interesting, but that's something that tends to be after the story is over and you're thinking of it, in kind of schematic, right? Well, here's, I think, interestingly, someone who thinks that we do. This is Austin, who thinks that we do have all the stuff that I and you have been saying we don't have, okay? What Austin wants us to do is look a little closer at what we see in the story. Do we not see some depth that a moment ago I was suggesting that we don't, following your lead, if you will? And here's what he has to say. Though, quote, Montressor proves himself to be somewhat of a sociopath, agreeing with the consensus that's established so far in the story. Note, for example, the glee Montressor derives from even thinking about killing Fortunato, the smile he smiles at the thought of Fortunato's immolation. There's several moments of the story, nonetheless, for all these psychopathic moments or sociopathic moments, there's several moments throughout the story in which Montressor shows hesitation or even guilt. And I think this was the best approach to the counterclaim, okay, that we have, the counterclaim to the claim that we've been offering up to this point, that there just isn't much interest in depth. Do we not have moments where even if the depth is not explored, at least it's pointed at, gestured at? And it's gestured at that there's rich depth that, conceivably could be analyzed and maybe even can be analyzed up to a point, right? Even though you can tell that the character himself doesn't want to really go there. He can't help but go there. Let me just read you what Austin had to say. Do we not, upon struggle, here's one of those moments, towards the end of the story especially, upon struggle and screaming for Fortunato, Austin writes, Montressor mentions that for a brief moment I hesitated, I trembled. At the end, quote, he even mentions that his heart grew sick on account of the dampness of the catacombs. As Austin argues, clearly demonstrating that Montressor shows, some sort of guilt or remorse on some level. Due to his conflicted nature, it is nearly impossible for the reader to tell what his true motivations might be, but we can tell that there's some sort of conflict in his motives there. That's what I think Austin is suggesting, and we get a little bit of a sense of what those motives might be, even if we can't decide which is his truest, right? Which is the motive that is central, if there is a central motive. Is Montressor truly a good person who was simply driven too far by an abusive person in his life? Or is he something closer to a sociopath who feels little to no remorse for a murder that he didn't really need to commit, but that he felt like committing, right? Looking for an excuse to commit. And you can see how we have that radical symmetry at the end there. Open up this symmetry of possible explanations where the two balance each other out and we can't really choose which one we want to credit, to the extent that we see some signs of a conscience after all in what appears, to so many of us, including Austin, throughout a lot of the story, we would say, no, we don't. But there are just these few moments where something seems to open up and things get very interesting indeed. And I wanted to offer a couple of comments on the conversation that we're having down here below. Okay, I believe it easy to overlook, all right, as I think Austin did not, how important it is that we recognize that Montressor's story is something told. It is indeed a story. It is the story of a plot against Fortunato. But I think it's also a story with a plot. Montressor is a plotter, but I want to argue that so is Poe. And Poe's plot is not equal to Montressor's plot. That is, Montressor plots against Fortunato. I want to argue that Poe plots against Montressor. Montressor is a real character, you may feel. He's a cool cat. He has style, that business with the trowel, for example. But stylistic chill does not indicate emotional or psychological depth. One can still see one can see why one might see little of such depth for all the style. And this is kind of rehashing the consensus that we established above before being troubled by Austin. Quote, Montressor is quite static. If he had truly felt insulted, wouldn't one feel some sort of emotion when he finally gets his revenge at the very end of the story? Anything at all. This is what a student wrote. Be it happy, sad, regretful, anything, which just makes it feel he killed just to kill with no motive at all. But reading plot-wise, yeah, I'm working that in here. Getting beyond mere story and reading for plot. Do we not stop and ask, doesn't he feel some sort of emotion there at the end? That's exactly the point that Austin is making. He does feel some sort of emotion there at the end. Back up a bit if we want to try to get to the heart of what that emotion is. Why is he telling us this story? Wait, who is he telling this story? Remember this at the very beginning. You who so well know the nature of this soul. Who is that? His confessor? Who is this? I like the notion of it being some sort of religious figure. You'll understand why maybe in a moment. Why include these certain details, which you easily miss when we just read along for the story, for the what of what's happening? We allow ourselves to get caught up in the spectacle of this, right, of this event, which is, I think you would agree, pretty spectacular. Look at what he answers. when Montresor, when he's addressed by Fortunato, right? How he answers when Fortunato, in a sense, asks a question, for the love of God, Montresor, and then waits impatiently for a reply when he repeats, yes, for the love of God. Why? Why? Right? Why does he wait? Depth of motivation emerges as we read plot lines. Character emerges, real character. Montresor, getting back to Austen's claims and Austen's evidence, recalls feeling sick at heart as he finishes the job, but quickly adds something Austen didn't get into, as if feeling the need to control his auditor's understanding. It was due to the dampness of the catacombs, as opposed to what? As opposed to like a moral illness at the contemplation of what he has done, even for what he did 50 years ago that he's lived with for 50 years. What's his motive? Its ultimate formulation I leave to you, but I think the ultimate object of his plot is, and here's where I think things get very interesting and intuitive, God himself. He feels unloved by God, the God who has favored Fortunato. Favored by men, beloved of men, favored by God. Montresor, neither of those things. So anyway, I wish we had more time now. We could really explore this story as what I see as Montresor's plot against God. A plot that he's not even aware, at some levels not even aware of, very uncomfortable with, but nevertheless we have evidences there. Hey, that's enough for this week. It's already long enough. Micro lecture. Onward, onward.